either surf it or you get wiped out.
The Surfer is a 2024 thriller from Irish director Lorcan Finnegan and Irish writer Thomas Martin, starring Nicolas Cage as the titular surfer. Its plot is fairly simple. When Cage's surfer seeks to move to an exclusive area of Australia renowned for its surfing, he finds himself at odds with locals who seek to exclude outsiders from their turf, led by Julian McMahon's menacing Scally, an increasingly surreal battle that sees the surfer having everything stripped away from him. Nick Cage really is great here, yet again, and I couldn't be happier for one of the greatest actors of his generation, to have turned around perceptions of his abilities to the extent that is pretty much universally accepted. Whereas little as a decade ago he was considered something of a punchline, with The Surfer the latest in a string of great roles that asked him to stretch himself and proved only that his talent is elastic.
The rigging on at Cloud's Casino is puttanesca pasta.
Hey, fisherman,
Did you catch a fish?
I can see some finding this film a somewhat frustrating watch, and the "well, I would have done this" crowd will no doubt absolutely hate it. But I think a lot of what it's doing is in service of a larger theme and allegory, which I almost always do, and that's pretty much what my channel is about, so I thought it was great. Thomas Martin's script is whip smart, never belabouring its themes but having them simmer through in a subtle undertow, while Finnegan's direction is simply stunning. Hazy greens and yellows, glorious vistas filling the screen, contrasting with the dowdiness of the car park the surfer largely finds himself trapped in, and the sickly unreal greens of street lamps tormenting him at night. Evocative not just in its own right, but in paying homage to and building on classic films from Australian cinema history. Before I go on, spoiler warning for The Surfer, although if you are familiar with my videos you'll know I don't really have any interest in recounting the plot and cracking wise over bits that may seem funny taken out of context. And I'm instead going to assume that any viewer of this video has seen the film themselves and is here for discussion of its themes and influences. I'll start not by talking about The Surfer directly, but by looking at a few other films I think it's in dialogue with and what that says.
I always knew I'd come home to Australia one day, but it's this place.
I think there are three key Australian films that The Surfer shares elements with, spiritual ancestors if not direct descendants. 1971's Wake in Fright and Walkabout, and 1978's Long Weekend. This is primarily shown in subtly and sometimes not so subtly, lifting imagery and beats from all of the above. Shots of nature often seem to be direct homage to Walkabout. The rat scene of The Surfer mirrors the possum attack of Long Weekend, while, as an example of a few from Wake in Fright, a scene where the surfer perceives everyone to be laughing at him seems to crib directly from a very similar scene from the 1971 film. But what really interests me is not so much that this has been done, but why? What does it say to so strongly align yourself with existing media? Well as these films being visually striking on their own, ripe for homage if nothing else. Perhaps it is telling that these are films with distinct narratives and depictions of Australian culture that are also awash with subtext. Take 1978's Long Weekend, from Australian director Colin Eggleston, an eco-horror where an unlikable suburban couple head to a beautiful and secluded beach to patch up their failing marriage, and find nature fighting back as they sully it. A metaphor for humanity thoughtlessly defiling the planet, assuming dominion of its natural beauty, that they and we have the right to control, consume and destroy as we wish, not realizing they are trespassers, that we share this world, not rule it. It's belated pleasure coming from watching two quarrelling shit-eels getting their comeuppance, as the natural world decides it's had enough. In Nick Roeg's 1971 Walkabout, a tragic event leaves a brother and sister stranded in the Australian outback, where they encounter a First Nations boy on a coming-of-age walkabout, a metaphorical ghost of a culture marginalised and banished, who leads them back to a civilization so cruel it breaks his heart and his spirit. Walkabout really is a great film, Roeg's visuals mythologizing the glorious and desolate vistas of the outback, juxtaposing them with the dull and harsh cities built on top. His outsider's eye meshing perfectly with the film's themes, a melancholic lament for innocence lost in a march towards progress, an adherence to etiquette and order underlying a de-civilization of spirit, as the land the First Nations boy is simpatico with is stripped mined for anything of value. While there are definitely elements of these two films and their themes in The Surfer, in terms of direct influence, British director Ted Kotcheff's Wake in Fright is clearly the key touchstone. Not just low-key Christmas movies. but both, like Walkabout, Australian films made by outsiders, mythologizing the land in similar ways but for very different purposes. Wake in Fright sees Gary Bond's schoolteacher John Grant slowly losing his identity, as he is essentially trapped by circumstance in a metaphorical whoop-whoop, known by locals as the yabba, that is addiction made manifest, men drinking themselves to oblivion, brawling like animals and betting everything they have on the toss of a coin. A world where time means nothing, a pervasive blokish friendliness belying that the true currency of the yabba is not judging in exchange for not being judged, the camaraderie of reaching the bottom of the barrel together and scrapping over the last drops, the only thing that is off limits being the word no.
What's wrong with you, you bastard? Why don't you come and drink with me? I just brought you 50 miles late and doesn't you want to drink with me?
While it's obviously an allegory for alcoholism,
I'm a doctor of medicine and a tramp by temperament. I'm also an alcoholic.
And addiction in general, it's also a deeply unflattering outsider's view of traditional Australian masculinity, brought to a head in a gruesome to the extent of unwatchability depiction of a kangaroo hunt, with real footage from a real hunt used, in consultation with Australian animal rights activists, to illustrate to an audience how barbaric these practices are, an extension of a narrative that depicts Australian masculinity as one step removed from barbarism itself. All of these films are both character study and broader allegory, related to the surfer through that as much as stylistic tics. And like Wake in Fright and Walkabout in particular, the surfer is an outsider's view of Australia, perhaps able to look with a clearer lens at structures and behaviours that have become normalised over time, one looking at the way things are and the other at what has been taken, both themes the surfer toys with. Nick Cage's surfer himself shares DNA with Wake in Fright's John Grant, clinging to a dream, living in the past, fleeing from a present that doesn't seem to be working out. A wife who has left him, a kid who doesn't seem to want to be around him, a man who seeks to outrun a generational trauma that defines him by fleeing to a past where he was happiest, an oasis of nostalgia in a desert of the present, manifesting a future that he feels will ripple through his life and fix all of his other problems.
The girls will be here and the kids too.
Okay. Or maybe just you and me and a couple of beers.
Also like Wake in Fright, it's this deterioration of his life that leaves him easy prey for a toxic culture, not being satisfied with who he is, allowing others to strip him of his identity, his self-worth tied up in what he isn't, not what he is. But he finds not the friendly alcoholics who seek only people willing to wallow with them at the bottom of a beer can of the 1971 film, but instead being indoctrinated through suffering by what are recognisably representations of modern masculinity grifters.
Made the modern male too soft. He expects everything handed to him. He's forgotten how to suffer.
What do you do about that? Well, you accept it. That's what life is like. It's suffering.
And you're only going to know things through pain and suffering.
After all, that is literally the plot. The surfer being forced to wait at the gates of this Sigma sanctuary, suffer enough hardships to prove he is worthy.
Got to be shunned before you can demand acceptance.
Proving his mettle in combat. Before finally being allowed to enter the Bay Boys' war room, and finding out that being accepted by these beefed-up man-children isn't the Garden of Eden he thought it would be, as reality is reflected back at him through the eyes of his son, trauma passed down to yet another generation, cycles repeating over and over. And maybe it would be enough to say that this is the point, a commentary on masculinity refracted through the lens of the famously masculine culture of Australia, epitomised through their cinema, not just Wake in Fright and its friendly but toxic culture, but characters like Barry Mackenzie, created as satire but adopted unironically by the targets of its mockery as a hero, tracing a line through the out-of-control masculinity of the worlds of the Mad Max films, the salt-of-the-earth blokishness of Paul Hogan's Crocodile Dundee.
He's got a knife.
That's not a knife.
All the way through to the more nasty depiction of Wolf Creek.
This is a knife.
With the ending of 1974's Aussie biker flick Stone also foreshadowing the final stretch here, as a cop embedded in a biker gang to catch someone offing their members is seduced by their culture.
They just up and do the sort of things that a lot of people would like to be able to do.
But when they beat him half to death for taking the culprit into custody, rather than letting them enact their own form of justice, with his possible dying breaths he demands adherence to their code, just as in The Surfer, suffering that stems from a desire to be accepted by a toxic culture. Beyond that, perhaps it is also telling that the Bay Boys are not down-and-out surf bums, even if it seems like they never leave that small stretch of beach. These are successful businessmen, real estate agents, doctors, the police force, even bankers.
G'day, mate. I'm the bank manager.
Seemingly representing every aspect of power in society. Does this symbolize a ruling class? A representation of patriarchy that demands cultural assimilation and fealty to its cruel ideas? And if that's the case, why stop there?
That's my church out there.
Surfing itself, an integral part of the Australian cultural identity, but synonymous not just in Australia but globally, with an image of whiteness, toned bodies and sun-bleached blonde hair. And this is despite surfing actually having been appropriated itself, originating in Polynesia, most obviously Hawaii, where it was the sport of kings, but practiced by every member of society and where wave riding contests were most prevalent. Although it has been argued that this was itself just an extension of the Polynesian colonization of Pacific Islands, with its roots shared across the Oceania diaspora. The photojournalist and documentarian John Ogden claims that First Nations people were actually surfers themselves, long before the sport became culturally dominant in modern Australia, a claim that has been deemed controversial, but which seems to be backed up by an 1867 book by Victoria-based swimmer and schoolteacher Charles Steedman, Manual of Swimming, which includes a chapter called Native Swimming, Wave Mechanics and Surfboards, which describes a small deal board around 5 feet long, 1 foot broad and an inch thick, termed a surfboard, as well as contemporary photography such as this picture of a traditional tide rider from 1917. There is also evidence of Incan or even pre-Incan surfing in Peru and in West Africa, with some accounts from the 17th century seeming to describe the practice in Ghana, with this picture from 1923 showing traditional Padua planks. In all of these instances, surfing in whatever form it existed was largely lost to colonization, along with many other aspects of their cultures, particularly starkly with Christian colonization of Hawaii, the culture that celebrated surfing the most, seeing the practice banned in 1823. Much of its repopularization can be traced to Duke Kahanamoku, a native Hawaiian and renowned Olympic swimmer, who integrated traditional surfing into exhibitions all around the globe. This saw the sport becoming increasingly popular in America and Australia particularly, but in a way that appropriated and was exclusive. For example, in America, segregation laws in some areas and less overt locals-only policies in others.
Don't live here. Don't surf here.
Often saw African Americans banned from the most desirable public beaches, forced to use strips of coast that were often polluted or less hospitable, like Buzzards Point, downstream from a sewage plant in DC, or the grossly contaminated Lake Pontchartrain in New Orleans. And where they weren't banned, they would often avoid beaches regardless due to potential harassment from groups like the Malibu Locals Only gang.
Locals only. Don't live here, don't surf here.
Whether wittingly or not, surfing reflected white supremacy. In fact, according to Daniel Duane writing in the New York Times, the first commercial surfboard sold in California in the 1930s was a brand that I can't name on YouTube. And I'm also going to have to blur the symbol itself just to be safe, with the name being changed to Waikiki Surfboards in 1937, 8 or 9 depending on the source, which still seems a little late if you ask me, although the use of this symbol and similar iconography persisted in surf culture post-war, where there can be no doubt as to its intent, not just through surf gangs but also through prominent surfers like renowned racist, the King of Malibu, Mickey Dora. From a sport for every member of society, surfing became a sport of privilege, whether that was directly intended or just a reflection of marginalization in general, increasingly commercialized and exclusionary, not just reflecting a dominant masculinity, but white colonialist cultural dominance. In the surfer, we see this reflected in what is recognizably localism.
Locals only!
And maybe it simply reflects that, a kind of straw dog's-ass disdain for outsiders. But Nick Cage's surfer was actually born on this land. He is a local, and I can't help but feel that its intentionally heightened and surrealistic narrative serves as an allegory for precisely the kind of colonialism that surfing itself represents if you dig deep enough into its history, a sport that was stolen from its inventors and became synonymous with white patriarchal supremacy. That maybe the surfer is an allegory for the treatment of First Nations people in Australia.
You don't belong here anymore.
It can be narratively frustrating. Why doesn't the surfer just leave? But allegorically, why should he? This is his home. This is his identity. Living here as he wishes is his sole dream. He feels he has played by the rules and deserves it, while those with power strip him of everything. Assault, bully, gaslight, demand he demean himself, and ultimately accept their dominance. Observe the same customs, be influenced by the same beliefs, hopes and loyalties as them, before he is deemed fit to take his place in their community. There is no question that is literally the plot of the film, right? And does it perhaps bear some resemblance to the policy of assimilation enacted by the Australian government towards First Nations people, which demanded they observe the same customs and are influenced by the same beliefs, hopes and loyalties as other Australians, before they were deemed fit to take their place in the community? More obviously dealing directly with this theme, the shark-tooth pendant is clearly symbolic of First Nations culture, directly reminiscent of the pendants worn by coastal First Nations people, representing their bond to land and sea, and here, as in real life, symbolic of the commercialization of their culture, stolen and divorced from meaning, a prize in a surfing competition they are excluded from, or sold to tourists as authentic merchandise. The Bay Boys' rituals, too, steal from First Nations culture, merging them with a perverse Christian symbolism, with Julian McMahon Scally as maybe a John the Baptist figure, or maybe even Christ himself from the Last Judgment, which again could be a nod to colonialism, where Christianity was imported and enforced, while indigenous cultures were marginalized and subsumed, at the same time as being caricatured and commercialized. To return to Nick Rogue's Walkabout to illustrate this, a scene where white Australians are seemingly using First Nations people as slaves to make cheap tat, crude racist baubles to be sold as genuine Australian articles, simultaneously exploitation and cultural theft. What about Nick Kassim's character known only as the Bum, refusing to assimilate, stripped of all material wealth, living in a ramshackle car, harassed by the police, not just a warning to the surfer that this treatment can continue forever if he doesn't bow to the Bay Boy's wishes, but also wanting to avenge his lost son? And could this be a reference to the Stolen Generations, a set of policies enacted by Australian governments from 1910 to the 1970s that saw children put into institutions, fostered or adopted out to non-Indigenous families? Many suffered harsh, degrading treatment, abuse, and were frequently indoctrinated to believe Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people were inferior, or that their parents were dead or did not want them. While these are certainly things of the past, just like colonialism itself, their skeletal fingers stretch into the present, reflected in attitudes and structures, no longer explicit in laws and policies, but implicit in culture. The generational trauma of this marginalization still felt, and the systemic biases created by it still apparent. First Nations people still suffer from economic disparities, with a significantly lower median wage, housing inequality, with 1 in 4 reliant on social housing, still find themselves targeted by the police at a higher rate, being overrepresented both in deaths in custody and in instances of police brutality, and are the most incarcerated people per capita on Earth. Colonialism is a spectre that looms over Australian culture, and its shadow is of a white man holding a surfboard, riding a wave that has wiped countless others out. The surfer's sole First Nations character, Miranda Tapsell's photographer, is one of the few characters in the film who shows kindness and empathy while expecting nothing in return, and who, perhaps tellingly, has an artifact from the surfer's past that shows him he hasn't lost his mind, a reminder of an identity that the Bay Boys seek to strip him of, a cycle she has seen before firsthand, symbolically representing not only how it is being repeated, but how moot it is in this form, a battle over ownership of land and culture that were themselves stolen.
You're just not meant to be here.
Even if the surfer's experiences can be seen as an allegory for the treatment of First Nations people under colonialism, it's a microcosm that he suffers after a whole life of benefiting from those structures. Privilege that may be stripped away over the course of the film, but which can be gifted straight back to him. And maybe the ending is a reflection of this too, as Cage's surfer rejects not just the toxic masculinity of the Bay Boys, but this whole battle, finally understanding that none of this is his to own, whether as part of a pack or as a rugged individual, that the desire for dominion over land and culture is itself destructive. Finally understanding that greed, acquisition, exclusion, and the destruction wrought by them aren't the lessons we should be handing down from generation to generation. Lorcan Finnegan and Thomas Martin's The Surfer is an Australian movie made by outsiders, offering a critiquing eye on Australian culture, as well as a broader allegory that stretches across universal boundaries. Its lack of specificity intentionally asking us if we can see these patterns elsewhere too. Toxic masculinity is an allegory for patriarchal structures. Localism is an allegory for systemic oppression of the other. Surfing is an allegory for colonial theft. Generational trauma over the loss of a father is an allegory for generational trauma over the loss of a culture. Cycles that may take new forms but still endlessly repeat all over the world, like waves crashing over and over against the shore.
That was my best surfing as a metaphor for life speech. I was hoping for a little more enthusiasm.
Thank you very much for watching. If you listened to this, you made it all the way to the end, thank you. If you saw the surfer differently to me or just absolutely hated it and want to vent, feel free to comment below. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe and share if you think someone else would enjoy it too, as well as check out some of my other videos. They're all this kind of thing, more or less, and it would be super cool. Thanks for watching. Hopefully I'll see you next time.